morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. OppenheimerFunds is also very proud to be here today. Did you get a chance to eat the breakfast? You saw back there, of course, there were these delicious treats that were full of fat, full of sugar, and of course, you crave them, you want them. You want to grab them and shove them in your face right away. You know, human beings have this cognitive bias towards short-term thinking. And that has helped us survive, but it hasn't really advanced civilization. You know, early in our history, we needed to have this short-term thinking to find the food that was right in front of us now, because we might not get another meal for who knows when, to run from that predator right in front of us now. We wanted to get more donuts. But again, that did not advance standards of living. It took 6,000 years for standards of living to double. Yet, around 1750, that started to accelerate. Since then, standards of living have doubled about every 50 years. Why? Well, I think it can be traced back a couple hundred years earlier to what was the true dawn of the information age, and that, of course, was the invention of the Gutenberg printing press. For the first time, human knowledge could be mass replicated and distributed across distances and distributed across generations. It was the first time we were able to overcome our genetic limits in terms of memory. And with this knowledge, we began to be able to plan for the long term. Now, fast forward to today. We still have this bias towards instant gratification, but it's being fed by modern culture. So we're at risk of losing some of the gains that we've made. What time frames do we talk about now? Well, there's a 24-hour news cycle to win. There's 140 characters to get out. We do 3 billion Google searches in a day. Our attention spans aren't getting longer, they're getting shorter. If we keep jumping from screen to screen and from story to story, we're not exercising the cognitive muscles in our brains that allow us to think for the long term. In the 5 seconds it took me to say that sentence, some of you might have received a text or checked your email. It's not your fault. We feel a reward when we get a text. You know, the culprit is dopamine. We're chemically wired to seek pleasure. And we're indulged with these information donuts by modern society, and that's crowding out our ability to think for the long term. You know, when you look at some of the big problems that society faces today, we're trying to solve them with short-term thinking, which simply cannot work. Take global warming. Most of the solutions on the table simply amount to calls to roll back progress, to stunt growth. Oh, and build your house on stilts. Why can't we step back and engineer a meta solution to this problem? Because it takes long-term thinking. Healthcare in this country continues to be, in my opinion, a little bit of a tangled mess. We put layer upon layer of regulatory band-aids on an already Byzantine system, and yet the system just gets more expensive, and our outcomes aren't any better. Why can't we rise above, you know, petty, narrow interests and view the problem holistically? You know, finding someone to blame and firing them seems to be as far as we go in solving many of our big problems. My industry provides a very vivid example of the problems of short-term thinking. Investors continuously leave enormous amounts of money on the table because of poor timing decisions with their investments. There was a study of the Fidelity Magellan Fund, which was run by Peter Lynch, very successfully for many, many years. The return over his tenure was about 20% per year. But do you know what the average return experienced by investors was over that same period? Investors in his fund, because of the flows in and out they did over his tenure? It was zero. It wasn't 20%, it was zero, because they bought high and sold low over and over again. More broadly, we looked at stock returns going back to 1995, and we found that the investor experience was shy of the returns of the market by about $1.5 trillion. Think about that. That's the GDP of about a mid-sized country that people left on the table because they were reacting to short-term news. And it just keeps on and on. We had that big stock sell-off in August because people were worried about the Federal Reserve raising rates. In the wake of that sell-off, U.S. mutual fund investors pulled $10 billion out of equity funds. Well, what happened after they did that? Well, the market has rallied back, and today we're back about where we were before the August sell-off. But investors who pulled out turned those temporary losses into permanent losses. So we as a people and as a society have to figure out ways to overcome our genetic wiring towards this short-term thinking. We at Oppenheimer are trying to do our little bit to overcome that by helping investors think for the long term. The practical solution to this is to set a financial plan and keep it for the long term. And it shouldn't be hard. We have to stop looking at short-term earnings. Stocks usually go up. Over the last 90 years, any 15-year period, and 15 years is a long time, right? You have to have a long-term view. Over any 15-year period, stocks had positive rates of return 99.8% of the time. So at Oppenheimer, we've developed a program to share with our investors and their advisors on how to think for the long term, debunk myths, and ease some of those fears. And we've trained every one of our customer-facing people on how to share this program with their contacts. I applaud the work of our next speaker, Larry Fink, in reaching out to CEOs of companies and encourage them to not focus on delivering a quarterly result, but invest for the long term in their companies. So what else can companies do to think for the long term? This conference will energize that discussion. We have a long list of luminaries who will be speaking to you today, many of whom are titans in the tech industry. You know, they've done so much to shape our future, and yet, let's face it, they have also contributed to this short-term gratification, the information donuts we all seek, that are part of the problem. I'll be interested to hear what they think about how to position their firms for the long term and how they get us all thinking more on a long-term view. You know, big ideas can solve big problems. But humans have this bias towards short-term thinking, and in particular, it's common for humans to think right now is the most perilous time ever for human existence. But that's not true. It has never been a better time to be alive. We live longer, we're healthier, we're richer, we're more literate, we're less likely to die in battle. Every day, fewer people live in poverty. So I believe that technology can continue to trump scarcity. Malthus will continue to be wrong. But again, it takes big thinking to solve the problems that we have. JFK set a goal to put a man on the moon over the course of a decade. A decade's a long time in politics, and we did it. It just took some visionary thinking. Big thinking can solve these problems. Long-term thinking can solve these problems. It just takes inspired and inspiring leaders like you. So, to wrap up, OppenheimerFunds believes in the right way to invest. We have explicit principles on what we think that means, one of which is invest for the long term. That's why we're so proud to partner with Andrew Ross Sorkin and sponsors today's conference. I'm sure it's going to be a fascinating day.